What would you do if one day you woke up and discovered that the God you worshiped, the God you thought was unshakably present, had left? Not in anger alone, not in silence alone, but visibly, deliberately, his glory rose and departed. For the people of Israel, this wasn't just a nightmare, it happened. And standing in the middle of that devastation was one man, a priest without a temple, a prophet who performed the unthinkable, a man who ate a scroll of judgment, lay on his side for more than a year, shaved his head with a sword, and became a living sign of warning and hope. This is the story of Ezekiel the prophet, who saw the throne of God move, who watched glory leave, and who heard the promise that one day glory would return. Are you ready for the vision that shook a nation and could change the way you see God forever? Chapter 1, The Call of the Watchman, the Shadow of Exile. The year was around 593 BC, and Judah, once the proud remnant of David's kingdom, was crushed under Babylon's iron rule. The streets of Jerusalem, once filled with pilgrims singing psalms, were now silent, their stones stained with smoke and tears. Babylon, the unstoppable empire, had dragged thousands into captivity. Chains clinked on wrists that once lifted prayers. Harps were hung on willow branches, their strings gathering dust, because no one could bear to sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land. Among those captives was a young man named Ezekiel. He wasn't a soldier or a king. He was a priest in training, the son of Buzi, raised for a life that had suddenly vanished. From childhood, his world had been defined by the temple. He had smelled incense rising at dawn, memorized the sacred words of the Torah, and imagined the day, his 30th birthday, when he would finally step into the temple courts as an ordained priest. That dream was more than a career, it was his identity. But on that 30th year, the temple was far behind him, lying in ruins, and Ezekiel was kneeling in foreign dust. He woke up each morning by the Kbar River, surrounded by other exiles who whispered of home in voices cracked by grief. The temple, the altar, the holy courts, all were gone. And so Ezekiel carried a question that must have haunted him in the stillness. What is a priest without a temple? What does it mean to serve God when everything you've been trained to do is impossible? For many, exile was just a displacement. But for Ezekiel, it was the death of a calling, or so it seemed. What he didn't know was that in the silence something was stirring. The God of Israel, whose glory once filled a temple, was not finished. The very riverbank where Ezekiel felt forgotten would become the stage for one of the most shocking divine encounters in human history. The shattered dreams of a priest. Ezekiel's entire life had been a long preparation for a single purpose. From the day he could walk, he had followed his father into the sacred routines of a priestly family. He learned how to handle holy objects, how to pronounce blessings without error, how to memorize every law and ritual. His hands were trained for the temple, steady when slicing the sacrifice, careful when sprinkling the blood, reverent when lifting prayers. For 30 years, he carried the weight of that calling. But Babylon changed everything. When the empire's soldiers stormed Jerusalem, they didn't just break through walls, they broke destinies. Ezekiel's 30th birthday came the age when priests were finally ordained, but there was no temple to serve in. The altar he had imagined standing before was now a pile of rubble. The songs of worship he had rehearsed in his mind were drowned by the wails of captives. What does a man do when the very thing he was born to do becomes impossible? For a while, he must have felt like his life had been erased. In Babylon, there were no temple courts, no holy sacrifices, no smoke rising to heaven. There was only the dull routine of exile, fetching water, repairing huts, trading scraps of food. He probably sat by the Kbar River some evenings, staring at the water, asking questions he never thought he'd ask. Had God abandoned his people? Had God abandoned him? This is what makes Ezekiel's story so painfully human. Before he was a prophet, he was a man mourning the death of his first calling. He had to let go of the life he had planned before he could receive the one God had written. Sometimes the hardest moments are not when we are asked to do something new, but when we are asked to release something old. Ezekiel's priesthood died in exile, but from that death, something far greater would be born. Char. The silence before the storm. In the early years of exile, Ezekiel lived in what felt like a long silence. Days blurred together under the relentless Babylonian sun. The exiles built small houses out of clay and reeds, planted meager gardens, and tried to recreate some sense of normalcy. But nothing was normal. They were strangers in a strange land, watched by guards, mocked by their captors, surrounded by temples to foreign gods. For someone like Ezekiel, the dissonance was unbearable. He had memorized the words of the Torah that commanded purity, holiness, and worship in the sanctuary, and now he was trapped in a land of idols with no sanctuary to be found. He must have carried questions like stones in his heart. What do you do when every outward sign of God's presence is gone? When the altar has been torn down? When the songs have stopped? When the holy city lies in ruins, does God still hear you? Every sunrise seemed to echo the same hollow uncertainty. Yet this silent season was not wasted. It was a season of stripping away. Ezekiel's titles, his dreams, even his expectations of how God should work, all of it was laid bare. Sometimes God does his deepest work not in moments of action, but in seasons of stillness. The exile became Ezekiel's wilderness, a place where he was emptied. And though he didn't see it yet, that emptiness was not punishment, it was preparation. What Ezekiel couldn't know was that the silence would not last forever. Beneath the stillness, heaven was stirring. God was about to speak again, but when he did, it wouldn't sound like the soft voice Ezekiel expected. It would come like a storm, tearing open the sky, shattering everything Ezekiel thought he understood about his calling, about Israel, about God himself. The call by the river Kbar. One ordinary day, while the exiles toiled under the heavy sky of Babylon, something happened that would shatter the ordinary forever. Ezekiel was by the river Kbar, the water sluggish and brown, the air thick with the scent of mud and despair. He may have been lost in thought, or perhaps simply resigned to another day of silence, when suddenly heaven broke open. The text tells us it was not a dream. It was not a metaphor. The heavens were open, Ezekiel would later write, and I saw visions of God. Imagine the sky itself ripping apart as if creation couldn't contain what was about to be revealed. From the north came a storm, a great wind, a massive cloud flashing with fire. The very air must have trembled as Ezekiel's eyes widened in terror and awe. From the cloud emerged 4 living creatures unlike anything he or anyone had ever seen. They had the shape of humans, but each had 4 faces: a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Their feet shone like polished bronze, and their wings moved with the sound of rushing waters. Beside each creature was a wheel within wheels, sparkling like precious stone and covered with eyes. And above it all, high and radiant, was a throne of sapphire. And there on that throne was something like the appearance of a man burning with glory, surrounded by a brilliance like a rainbow in a storm. Ezekiel fell face down, overwhelmed, because there was only one conclusion: the glory of the Lord had come. The voice from the throne, flat on the ground, Ezekiel trembled. Every part of him screamed unworthiness. This was not just a vision, it was an encounter. And in the brilliance of the throne, the gap between heaven and earth had never felt wider. The figure seated on that sapphire throne radiated a presence that burned like fire and yet glowed like amber. It was both terrifying and strangely beautiful, and it was clear this was the glory of the Lord. Then came the voice. It was not a whisper, it was not even just a command. It was the kind of voice that seems to shake not just the air, but the marrow in your bones. Son of man, the voice said, a title that humbled Ezekiel, reminding him that he was only flesh. Stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. Ezekiel could not stand on his own. He was paralyzed by awe. But something extraordinary happened. The Spirit entered into me, he later wrote, and set me on my feet. It wasn't Ezekiel's own strength that raised him. It was God's Spirit lifting him, steadying him, preparing him. The call came clearly now, heavy with both authority and grace. I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has turned against me. These were not the words Ezekiel expected. Perhaps he thought he would be comforted, told of restoration, given a soft mission. Instead, he was handed a burden. He was to speak to a people described as obstinate, stubborn, and hard of heart. And whether they listened or refused, he must speak. This was the moment Ezekiel's life split in two. The priest who once longed for temple duties now became a prophet, a watchman, a messenger, a voice for God himself. The scroll and the mission. As Ezekiel stood trembling before the throne, the vision took another turn, one stranger and yet more intimate. A hand stretched out to him, holding a scroll. It was unlike any scroll Ezekiel had seen before. It was written on both sides, filled edge to edge, with words of lamentation, mourning, and woe. Every inch of it carried the weight of judgment. "Son of man," the voice said, "eat what is before you. Eat this scroll, then go and speak to the house of Israel. Eat the scroll." The command must have sounded impossible, even absurd. But this was not about feeding his stomach, it was about feeding his soul. Ezekiel took the scroll, pressed it to his lips, and consumed it. And something remarkable happened. Though it was filled with words of judgment, he said it tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth. Why sweet? Because even hard truth, when it comes from God, is life-giving. The bitterness would come later, as he lived out the words, as he felt their weight in his bones. But in that moment, the message of God became part of him, absorbed into his very being. Ezekiel would not just deliver God's words, he would embody them. This act changed everything. A priest reads sacred texts, but a prophet must eat them, live them, breathe them. The scroll in his stomach symbolized a message that would no longer stay on the page. From this point forward, Ezekiel's very life would become the sermon. The watchman on the wall. After the scroll was eaten, the vision did not simply fade, it sharpened. The voice of the Lord spoke again, sealing Ezekiel's mission with imagery that would define the rest of his life. "Son of man," God said, "I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Hear the word I speak and give them warning from me." The words were heavy, but they carried clarity. In the ancient world, a watchman stood on the city walls scanning the horizon. His task was simple but absolute. If danger approached, he sounded the alarm. If he stayed silent, lives would be lost and their blood would be on his hands. This was Ezekiel's new identity. No longer just a priest of rituals, he was now a prophet of warnings. He was called to stand on the spiritual walls of a broken nation, to see what they would not see, and to speak what they would not want to hear. His mission came with a terrifying responsibility. If he failed to speak, God said, "Their blood, I will require at your hand." It was an assignment without escape. He could not soften the message. He could not choose silence. He could not wait for an audience willing to listen. His duty was to speak regardless of the outcome. Ezekiel had been stripped of his temple, his city, and his old calling. But here beside the river, in the shadow of exile, he was given something greater. He was given a voice and a commission that would outlast empires. Chapter 2, the throne on wheels and the departing glory. The glory that moves Ezekiel's first vision by the river Kbar had shattered his world, but it also rewrote his understanding of God. As a priest, he had always imagined the glory of the Lord as fixed in one place in the temple between the cherubim above the mercy seat. The temple was the anchor of their faith, the center of worship, the proof that God was with them. But now the temple lay in ruins, and Ezekiel had just seen something that no theology class could prepare him, for the glory of God was on the move. The vision of the throne on wheels was not just strange, it was revolutionary. The wheels within wheels full of eyes suggested something that would have startled any Israelite. God's presence was not chained to Jerusalem. His throne was not trapped inside the Holy of Holies. He was mobile. He was sovereign. He was free. For the exiles, this truth must have been both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant that even in Babylon, they were not beyond God's reach. Terrifying because it meant the unthinkable. If his glory could come to them in exile, it could also leave the temple. This was not a safe assumption. For generations, Israel had assumed that as long as the temple stood, they were secure. But Ezekiel's vision cracked that illusion. The God of Israel was not a deity that could be contained by walls or manipulated by rituals. He was the God who moves unbound, unstoppable, and utterly holy. The vision that shook a nation. When Ezekiel shared what he saw, it must have landed like a hammer blow among the exiles. The very idea that God's glory could move challenged everything they thought they knew. To an Israelite, the temple wasn't just a building, it was the heart of their covenant. They believed the presence of the Lord dwelled there between the cherubim. The temple was the proof that God would never abandon them. But Ezekiel's vision painted a different reality. The glory of God wasn't sitting still in Jerusalem. It was moving. And if it was moving, it meant one terrifying thing: the Lord was not bound to the temple. His glory could leave. For people already crushed by defeat, this was almost unbearable. Imagine hearing in exile that the one thing that made your nation unique, the very presence of God, might no longer rest where it once did. It wasn't just a theological crisis, it was an identity crisis. But Ezekiel's vision didn't stop at tearing illusions apart. It offered a deeper truth. God's mobility didn't mean abandonment, it meant sovereignty. He was not a local deity limited to one patch of land. He was the Lord of heaven and earth, free to come and go, free to meet his people, even in the darkest places. This was the beginning of one of Ezekiel's hardest messages. God's glory would depart the temple. It would break their assumptions, but in the long arc of the story, it would also break their chains. The slow departure of glory. The book of Ezekiel later records one of the most heartbreaking visions in all of Scripture, the moment God's glory began to leave the temple. It didn't vanish in an instant. It wasn't an abrupt disappearance. It was a slow, deliberate departure, like a grieving parent walking away from a wayward child. Ezekiel describes the scene in vivid detail. First, the glory of the Lord lifted from above the cherubim inside the Holy of Holies and moved to the temple threshold. Imagine the golden light spilling across the stones, as if hesitating, as if waiting for someone to notice. Then the glory paused, lingering at the doorway, reluctant to leave. But the people didn't repent. They didn't even look up. Next, the glory moved to the east gate of the temple. Again it lingered. And finally, Ezekiel saw it rise and leave the city, heading toward the Mount of Olives. Step by step, glory moved away from Jerusalem. This slow exit was not because God was weak. It was because he was merciful. He gave his people chance after chance to turn back, to cry out, to repent. But they would not. For Ezekiel, this vision must have cut deeply. As a priest, he had once dreamed of bringing people into the presence of God. Now he was watching that presence leave. The temple was still standing, the rituals were still happening, but the glory was gone. It was the ultimate warning. What good is a temple without the God who fills it? The scene inside the temple. 4. Ezekiel saw the glory leave. God showed him why it was leaving. In one of his most disturbing visions, Ezekiel was taken by the Spirit back to Jerusalem, into the very courts of the temple. What he saw there was not worship, it was betrayal. Inside the temple, Ezekiel saw leaders of Israel bowing to idols carved on the walls. He saw elders secretly burning incense to false gods, thinking no one would notice. In another corner, women wept for Tammuz, a pagan deity of fertility. And most shocking of all, he saw priestmen who were supposed to face the altar turning their backs on the temple of the Lord, facing these to bow to the rising sun. This was not ignorance, it was willful rebellion. The temple still had the outer shell of religion, but its heart was corrupted. The people had turned the house of God into a marketplace of idols. For a priest like Ezekiel, this must have been devastating. He had grown up revering the temple, imagining it as the holiest place on earth. Now he was witnessing its desecration. It was not Babylonian soldiers who first drove God's glory away. It was the idolatry of his own people. This vision tore away any illusion Ezekiel might have had left. The departure of God's glory was not unfair, it was inevitable. The people had turned their backs on him long before he turned his back on the temple. The uncompromising message. Ezekiel was not sent to deliver comforting platitudes. From the moment he ate the scroll, his message was sharp-cutting and unrelenting. God had made it clear, "You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious." This was not an easy commission. Who wants to be the bearer of bad news to a people already broken? Who wants to tell them that their suffering wasn't just the result of Babylon's strength, but their own unfaithfulness? But Ezekiel could not soften the words. He could not dilute the warning. He was to tell them that judgment was coming not because God had abandoned his people, but because they had abandoned him. Their idols had filled the temple. Their leaders had grown corrupt. Their prophets had sold their words for profit. And God's patience, though long, had a limit. Every act Ezekiel performed, every word he spoke carried the sharp edge of truth. He warned of Jerusalem's coming destruction, not as a distant possibility, but as an unavoidable reality unless they turned back. His message burned with urgency: repent now, or face the fire of judgment. Ezekiel didn't get to choose a lighter task. He had to carry the weight of a holy God's uncompromising truth. And sometimes that truth stung the very people he longed to heal. The prophet of living signs. Ezekiel's words weren't his only message, his life became the sermon. God asked him to do things no ordinary man would ever choose, turning his very body into a prophetic canvas. One day God commanded Ezekiel to lie on his left side for 390 days, symbolizing Israel's years of sin, and then on his right side for 40 more for Judah's rebellion. Day after day, in front of a watching crowd, he lay there, his body a living indictment. On another occasion, he was told to shave his head and beard, something humiliating for a priest, and divide the hair into 3 parts, burning one part, striking another with a sword, and scattering the last to the wind. Each act was a warning. A third of the people would die by fire, a third by the sword, and a third would be scattered. He even dug a hole through the wall of his house and crawled out with his belongings on his back, acting out the coming exile of Jerusalem's last king. These weren't theatrical stunts. They were visual sermons, messages too urgent to be left to words alone. For the exiles watching it must have been unsettling. Their priest, once meant to lead them in quiet rituals, was now performing these strange, jarring signs. But that was the point. Their sin had become unthinkable, so the warnings had to be unforgettable. Through these acts, Ezekiel showed that a prophet doesn't just speak God's truth, he lives it no matter how much it costs. Glory departs, hope remains. Ezekiel's visions were heavy, his warnings relentless, and his signs strange. But through all of it, there was one truth that could not be erased, even as the glory of God departed. Hope was not gone. When Ezekiel saw the glory rise and leave the temple, it must have felt like the final heartbreak. The presence that once filled the Holy of Holies now hovered above the city walls, then lifted and moved toward the Mount of Olives. It was as if God himself was packing up and leaving. To a nation built on the promise of God's presence, nothing could have been more devastating. And yet, even in that devastating vision, there was a hidden mercy. The throne was on wheels. The glory moved, but it did not vanish. The same God who left the polluted temple could appear in exile. The same God who judged his people could also restore them. This was the paradox Ezekiel carried. He was the prophet of judgment, but also the prophet of hope. He had to announce that God's glory would leave, but also that it would return. The fire that burned away their illusions would also purify them for something new. For the exiles listening to Ezekiel, this tension was painful but necessary. They needed to know that God's presence would not tolerate their corruption, but they also needed to know he had not abandoned them forever. And so as the glory rolled away on those mysterious wheels, Ezekiel's message was not simply "you are judged." It was also "you are not forgotten." Chapter 3. Strange prophetic acts and shocking warnings. When words were not enough, for many prophets, words were their weapon. They thundered sermons, they declared visions. They spoke and spoke until their throats were raw. But for Ezekiel, God demanded something more radical. His life itself would become the prophecy. From the very beginning, Ezekiel understood that his calling would cost him more than comfort. It would cost his dignity, his habits, even his body. God didn't just give him speeches to deliver. He gave him actions to perform strange and unforgettable signs that would burn into the memory of anyone who saw them. Because words alone would not break through the hardness of Israel's heart. They had heard warnings before. They had heard prophets cry out for years. Their ears had grown dull. Their hearts were calloused. So God turned Ezekiel into a living illustration, a man whose very posture, movements, and silence would speak louder than any sermon. It was a calling that would stretch him beyond imagination. He would lie on his side for hundreds of days. He would cook food over dung. He would shave his head and beard. Each act, humiliating or exhausting, carried a message sharper than words. This is what your sin looks like. This is what judgment feels like. This is how far God is willing to go to get your attention. Well, 430 days on his side. God's first command to Ezekiel as a living sign was almost unthinkable. Lie on your left side, the Lord told him, and put the sin of the house of Israel upon yourself. You are to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side, 390 days. Every morning, Ezekiel would rise from his mat walk to the public square and lie down on his left side. Day after day, month after month, he stayed there under the sun, bearing the stares, the laughter, and the contempt of his neighbors. His body ached, his skin burned, and his dignity slowly eroded. But every single day declared the same message: Israel's sin has lasted this long, and its weight must be faced. When the 390 days ended, God spoke again. Now turn over on your right side and bear the sin of Judah. 40 more days. Think about what that meant. Ezekiel spent more than a year lying in public, his body turning into a calendar of judgment. People would pass by, shake their heads, mutter insults, or simply stare in uncomfortable silence. Every day, his unmoving figure shouted what words could not: the weight of sin is crushing, and judgment is not an idea, it's a reality. This act broke through the numbness of the exiles. They could ignore sermons, they could scoff at prophecies, but they could not unsee the image of a man lying in the dirt for over a year, carrying the guilt of an entire nation on his side. A meal on ashes. The next command was even stranger and far more humiliating. God told Ezekiel to take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt poor man's food and bake bread over human dung. The act was meant to symbolize the defilement Israel would suffer in exile. This, God said, is how the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them. For a priest like Ezekiel, this command must have been almost unbearable. Priests were trained to keep themselves pure to avoid anything unclean. Cooking over human waste was the ultimate violation. Ezekiel protested, pleading, "Sovereign Lord, I have never defiled myself." God showed mercy, but only partly. He allowed Ezekiel to use cow dung instead of human dung. Still, the point was clear: the bread would be baked over ashes, a meal of shame and survival, an enacted warning of what life would be like under foreign rule. Day after day, Ezekiel cooked and ate in front of the exiles. People watched as their prophet broke small pieces of coarse bread, tasted its bitterness, and swallowed humiliation with every bite. It was more than performance, it was embodiment. Through this act, Ezekiel sent a message. Words alone could never carry exile, would not be a dignified inconvenience. It would be a stripping away of identity, culture, and pride. A sword in his hand, a shaved head. If lying for over a year and baking bread on dung weren't shocking enough, God commanded Ezekiel to do something even more drastic: Take a sharp sword, the Lord said, use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. For a priest, this was more than uncomfortable. It was shameful. The law forbade priests from shaving their heads because their hair was a sign of dignity and consecration. Yet Ezekiel obeyed. With each stroke of the blade, clumps of hair fell to the ground, a silent sign that Israel's honor had been cut away. But the act didn't stop there. God told him to divide the hair into 3 parts. 1/3 he burned in fire inside the city model he had built. 1/3 he struck with the sword. And the final 1/3 he scattered to the wind with a warning that God's sword would chase even those who fled. Every strand told a story. 1/3 of the people would die in fire during Jerusalem's siege, 1/3 by the sword, and 1/3 would be scattered among the nations. Imagine the stares of the exiles watching this ritual. Each lock of hair on the ground was a reminder. Judgment was coming, and no one would escape untouched. By shaving his head and wielding the sword, Ezekiel turned himself into a living parable. The beauty of the priesthood stripped away the judgment of God, slicing through the nation's pride. Chapter: The Hole in the Wall. As if Ezekiel's strange actions hadn't already stirred enough whispers among the exiles, God commanded him to stage another sign, one that would replay the coming downfall of Jerusalem's last king. Dig through the wall in their sight, the Lord said. So Ezekiel took a tool and began hacking through the wall of his house while his neighbors watched. Dust flew, pieces of clay crumbled, and the sound of stone scraping filled the air. When the hole was wide enough, he slung a bag over his shoulder, pulled a cloak over his head to cover his face, and crawled through the gap like a fugitive in the night. The exiles must have stared in confusion. Why was their prophet digging through his own wall? Why cover his face? Why crawl instead of walking like a man? Then came the explanation. This was how King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, would try to escape the Babylonian siege through a hole in the wall under cover of darkness, face hidden in shame. But he would not succeed. Babylon's soldiers would capture him, blind him, and drag him away in chains. Every swing of Ezekiel's tool against the wall, every movement through that narrow opening, was a sermon without words. Even kings cannot hide from the judgment of God. The siege reenacted. Before Ezekiel ever spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem, he built it in miniature. God commanded him, take a clay tablet, set it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then he told Ezekiel to surround the little model with siege works, ramps, camps, and battering rams to depict the Babylonian army that would soon choke the real city. Ezekiel knelt in the dust, carving the outline of walls into the clay, pressing tiny stones for towers, stacking sticks for battering rams. Around him, people gathered, whispering, puzzled. Why was their prophet playing with clay like a child? But this was no game. This was prophecy in 3 dimensions. Ezekiel then took an iron pan and set it between himself and the model city. Make it an iron wall, God said, and turn your face toward it. It shall be under siege, and you shall lay siege to it. This will be a sign to the people of Israel. For days, Ezekiel stared at that clay city, his face fixed in relentless opposition. The iron pan symbolized the barrier between God and Jerusalem. The prayers of the city could no longer break through. This strange diorama said what sermons could not. Jerusalem's fate was sealed. The walls would not save them. The temple would not shield them. Judgment was coming, and it would be as real as the clay crumbling in Ezekiel's hands. A prophet among mockery, by now Ezekiel's life was a theater of the strange. He lay on his side for more than a year. He ate bread baked over dung. He shaved his head and swung a sword at piles of hair. He dug through his own wall and crawled out like a fugitive. To the exiles around him, he must have looked mad. Whispers spread. Has Ezekiel lost his mind? Is he cursed? Children laughed. Neighbors shook their heads, and even fellow Israelites mocked him. The priest who once held dignity in the temple now lay in the dirt, covered in dust and sweat, the object of ridicule. But Ezekiel kept obeying. Each act, as humiliating as it was, carried a weight heavier than his pride, the weight of God's message. His strange signs were not random, they were revelations in motion. And though people laughed, they also remembered. They could dismiss a sermon, but they could not forget the sight of a man lying still for 430 days, or the crack of a sword against his own hair and beard, or the sound of a wall crumbling under his hands. Mockery didn't stop Ezekiel because his mission wasn't to gain approval, it was to wake up a nation asleep in sin. Prophets rarely look sane to the people they confront. Holiness often feels like madness to those who love their idols. Through the jeers and whispers, Ezekiel bore the shame of obedience. And in doing so, he became what God had called him to be: a living sign, a walking warning, a voice that could not be silenced even when surrounded by laughter. Chapter 4, the Valley of Dry Bones and the Promise of Restoration. A promise in the darkness. Ezekiel had spoken words of judgment. He had performed signs of doom. He had watched in visions the glory of God leave the temple. For a time, it seemed like his whole calling was to break hearts, to shatter illusions, to declare that the end had come. But then the message shifted. God began to speak of restoration not as a vague comfort, but as a firm promise. I will take you out of the nations, the Lord said. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. For the exiles, these words must have sounded almost unbelievable. How could they go home when Babylon's chains were still on their wrists? How could they believe in hope when they still lived among ruins? Yet this was the turning point in Ezekiel's ministry. Judgment had to be proclaimed first because sin had to be confronted. But now God peeled back the clouds to reveal something greater. He was not only the God who judges, he is the God who restores. The exiles needed this word like dry ground needs rain. They had lost their city, their temple, their king, but they had not lost God. A new heart, a new spirit. Among all the promises Ezekiel received, few were as breathtaking as the one in Ezekiel 36. God didn't just promise to bring his people back to their land. He promised to change them from the inside out. I will sprinkle clean water on you, the Lord declared, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. This was more than national restoration. This was personal transformation. The exiles might have thought the problem was Babylon, or the loss of their temple, or the cruelty of their captors. But God pointed to the deeper issue: their own hearts. Their hearts had grown hard, stubborn, unresponsive to him. So he promised the unthinkable: a spiritual transplant. He would remove their heart of stone, the cold, lifeless heart that could not love him, and replace it with a heart of flesh, tender and alive. And not only that, he would put his spirit within them so they could actually walk in his ways. This was hope beyond geography. This was hope beyond politics. This was the kind of hope that reaches into the soul and remakes it. The Valley of Dry Bones. One day, God gave Ezekiel a vision so vivid, so strange, and so hopeful that it became one of the most iconic images in all of Scripture. The hand of the Lord was on me, Ezekiel wrote, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. Ezekiel looked around. The valley wasn't just sprinkled with bones, it was filled with them. Sun-bleached skulls, ribs, and spines covered the ground like shattered statues. Scripture says they were very dry, meaning they weren't just dead, they had been dead a long time. Then God asked a question: Son of man, can these bones live? Ezekiel must have felt the weight of that question. The obvious answer was no. Bones don't live, bones don't breathe, bones don't stand. But he answered with faith and humility, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. And then came the command that would change everything: prophecy to these bones. The scene was impossible. Preach to bones, speak to skeletons. Yet Ezekiel obeyed. He opened his mouth and words of life poured into a valley of death. The sound of life. Ezekiel obeyed the impossible command. He spoke to bones. Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord, he cried into the emptiness. And then it happened. Ezekiel heard at first a faint rattle in the distance, then another, then dozens more. The valley began to tremble as bones shifted and clinked against each other, finding their missing pieces. A spine reconnected, ribs curved into place, skulls tilted back onto necks. The sound grew louder, a chorus of rattling like hailstones on a tin roof until every bone had found its partner. Soon sinews appeared, weaving through the skeletons like threads. Flesh formed, skin wrapped around them. But there was still something missing. They were no longer bare bones, but they weren't alive. They were lifeless, forms silent and still. Then God spoke again, prophesied to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says, come breath from the four winds and breathe into these slain that they may live. Ezekiel spoke and the breath came. Wind swept through the valley, filling lungs that had been empty for centuries. Chests rose, eyes opened, and all around Ezekiel an army stood up, once dead bones now alive, living, breathing. Char. The Lord's explanation. As Ezekiel stood staring at the army of the resurrected, God's voice came again, clear, direct, and full of meaning. Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. The vision was not about literal skeletons walking the earth. It was about a nation that felt as dead as bones. The exiles had been saying, our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we are cut off. They felt finished, forgotten, beyond revival. But God's message was unmistakable. I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord. This vision turned a hopeless metaphor into a promise of restoration. God was telling his people, your despair is not the end. Your exile is not permanent. Your spiritual death is not final. And there was something even deeper here. The breath that filled those bones wasn't just air. It was the Spirit of God himself. This was a foretaste of something far beyond the return from exile. It was pointing toward the day when the Spirit would come and bring life to the lifeless, not just to a nation, but to all who believed him. Two sticks become one. After the vision of the dry bones, God gave Ezekiel another strange but powerful sign. He told the prophet to take two sticks. On one stick, Ezekiel was to write, belonging to Judah. On the other, he was to write, belonging to Joseph, Ephraim, and all the house of Israel. Then came the command, join them together into one stick, so they will become one in your hand. To the exiles, the meaning would have been unmistakable. Centuries earlier, the kingdom of Israel had split in two. The northern tribes, Ephraim, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. That fracture had never healed. Now both were broken, defeated, and scattered, but God was declaring something radical. I will make you one again. The picture was so simple a child could understand it, yet so profound that it redefined their future. The two sticks became in Ezekiel's hand, not by human diplomacy, not by a treaty, not by compromise, but by the power of God. This wasn't just about political unity, it was about spiritual unity. The divided people would not just share one land, they would share one king, one shepherd, one covenant. And Ezekiel was told to declare who that king would be. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. It was a prophecy that pointed forward not just to the return from exile, but to a greater king still to come. The glory returns. Ezekiel's early visions had been filled with judgment. He saw the glory of the Lord slowly, painfully leaving the temple. But his book doesn't end with absence. It ends with return. In the final chapters, Ezekiel is given one last sweeping vision, a new temple, a new city, a new reality. The prophet is carried by the Spirit to see the glory of the Lord coming back from the east. I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east, he wrote, and the sound of his coming was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. This was the reversal of the heartbreak. The same glory that once lifted off the temple now descended again, not to a polluted house of idols, but to a renewed sanctuary. God spoke, "This is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever." For the exiles, these words must have been like water to a desert soul. God was not finished. His departure was not abandonment. It was preparation for his return. And in the very last line of Ezekiel's prophecy, the name of the city is given, "The Lord is there." After all the judgment, after all the exile, after all the strangeness and pain, this is the final word: God will dwell with his people again. Yes, sir. Ezekiel's story is not an easy one. It is filled with visions that unsettle, judgments that burn, and actions that make us uncomfortable. He was mocked, misunderstood, and even considered mad. But through every strange sign, through every warning, and every tear, Ezekiel carried a message that was bigger than judgment. It was a message of hope. He saw the glory of the Lord leave, but he also saw it return. He spoke words of warning that shook a nation, but he also proclaimed a promise that could heal their hearts. And that promise is not just for ancient Israel. The same God who turned dry bones into a living army, the same God who promised a new heart and a new spirit, the same God whose glory came back to dwell among his people, he is still moving today. The question is not whether God can bring life where there is death. The question is, will we let him? Because maybe the story of Ezekiel isn't just about a prophet long ago. Maybe it's about us, about the places in our lives that feel like dry bones, and about the God who still whispers live.